Okay, in this chapter, we're going to look at addition of sine and cosine functions, and let's say like the sine of 45 plus 30. That's actually the sine of 75 degrees. And you might just try this on your calculator. Like, take out your calculator and find the sine of 75 degrees. It's equal to, let's see, sine 75, 0.9659. 0.9659. Now you would think that if you wanted to find the sine of 75, you could take the sine of 45, and you could take the sine of 30, and that's 1/2, and that's the square root of 2 over 2. That's 0.7 something. Let's see. Square root of 2 divided by 2, 0.707. This is 0.5. That adds up to 1.207, and I can't think if I can make this noise, but like, you got it wrong. It's my wrong noise. See, the sine of 75 degrees is not the same as adding the sine of 45 and 30. And so, whatever your inclination to do on these problems, you just have to stop. And don't do that. You have to learn new rules about how to add sine and cosine functions. Now here is a list of new rules, and not only do you have to learn them, but you have to memorize them. And so after you pause this video and copy them all down for a while, I'm going to give you some ways to memorize them. So I memorized that sine always goes sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So I'm looking here. Sine alpha plus beta is sine cosine plus cosine sine. And sine alpha minus beta is sine alpha cosine beta minus cosine alpha sine beta. So it always goes sine, cosine, cosine, sine. And when it's added, you add. And when it's subtracted, you subtract. So sine is always sine, cosine, cosine, sine. And I remember that sine stays
What we're doing right now in class.
the same
Would you be able to help me?
sine. Like when sine is added, I have a plus here, and when sine is subtracted, I've got a minus here. So then, if I have to do cosine of alpha plus or minus beta, I remember that cosine always goes cosine, cosine, sine, sine. And cosine doesn't stay the same sign like sine does. Cosine switches signs. So if the cosine says plus, you minus. And if the cosine says minus, you plus. So right here, where it says plus minus, the formula will say minus plus. And all of the letters, like this is alpha, beta, and then up here, alpha, beta, they stay the same. So now let's take that look at that problem I had, sine of, 75 degrees. Now I could break that down into sine of 30 plus 45. But now I know that if I have a sine function, sine functions go sine, cosine, cosine, sine. And when you're doing this identity for sine function, the sines, yeah, I said those in the wrong order, but anyway, the signs must match. The sign on sines must match. So since there's a plus sign right here, this is going to be plus. And this is 30, and this is 45, and this is cosine alpha 30, sine beta 45. So this is 1/2 times the square root of 2 over 2 plus the square root of 3 over 2 times the square root of 2 over 2, which is a square root of 2 over 4 plus the square root of 6 over 4. And so this is the square root of 2 plus the square root of 6 divided by 4. Now, you're actually going to leave your answers as exact values, but if you were to take that out and do it on a calculator, square root of 2 plus the square root of 6 divided by 4, you end up with the 0.9659, the right answer that we're looking for. So if you follow the rules, then numerically you're going to get the right answer. It's just a matter of learning the rules. In the first part of your homework assignment, you're going to practice doing these sum and difference formulas with exact values. So like if you had cosine of 60 minus 45, that would be the cosine of 15 degrees. In order to solve that, you know that cosine goes cosine, cosine, sine, sine. And you also know that cosine has the opposite sign, so if this is minus, that it's plus right here. So it's cosine 60, cosine 45, sine 60, sine 45. And it's, let's see, cosine 60 is a half, cosine 45, square root 2 over 2, sine 60, square root 3 over 2, sine 45, square root 2 over 2. This would be the square root of 2 plus the square root of 6 divided by 4. Didn't mean to pick a problem with the same answer, but you know that happens a lot when you do exact values. Now we will be doing identities with these, but I'll have a separate video on the identities problem. For today, you're just going to be working out numeric values. Let's say the question asks you to find the cosine of, let's see, let's do 45 plus 60. 105 degrees. I just totally gave that away because the book is actually going to say cosine of 105, and you're going to have to think through, like, how do I use my exact values like 30 or 60 or 90 or 45? How do I use one of my exact values to get there? And in this case, it's going to be 60 and 45. So then I know which two functions it is. It's cosine of 45 plus 60. Doesn't matter which order you write them in. And I know that cosine is cosine, cosine, sine, sine. And I know that cosine always uses the opposite sign, so that's minus. And so cosine 45, cosine 60, sine 45, sine 60. And this is the square root of 2 over 2, and this is 1/2, and this is the square root of 2 over 2, and this is the square root of 3 over 2. So this is going to be the square root of 2 minus the square root of 6 divided by 4. Which, if you notice, comes out negative, but that's all good because the cosine is supposed to be negative in this quadrant. Last example, we'll find the sine of 165 degrees. So you've got 90 and 45 and 30 and 60, and you need to get to 165. Wow, I had to think about that for a minute. This is going to be the sine of 120 plus 45. There we go. Which isn't on my exact value list, which is why I was blanking, but you can use anything on the unit circle, and 120 is one of our exact values in the unit circle. So next up, you have to have your function memorized. Remember, sine goes sine, cosine, cosine, sine. And sine always has the same sign. So if this is plus, this is plus. Okay, sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So now we have to figure out each of these exact values. Sine of 120, cosine of 45, cosine of 120, sine of 45. And then you might have to draw a 120 degree angle and note that it's got a 60 degree reference angle. And so this is 1/2 down here, and that's a square root of 3 over 2 right there. And so sine of 120, square root of 3 over 2, cosine of 45, square root of 2 over 2. Cosine of 120 is negative 1/2, and the sine of 45 is a square root of 2 over 2. So this is going to be the square root of 6 minus the square root of 2 divided by 4. Now, we're just practicing these with numbers so that we can do them without numbers, and we're going to do them with identities in the next class. But numbers practice is good, and after you take your quiz and identities, the whole assignment will be about numbers.